The small Indiana town held its breath as the diner's neon sign flickered above the entrance, casting a warm, inviting glow. Checkered curtains framed the windows, swaying slightly in the breeze, like old friends waving hello. This place wasn't just a diner, it was a relic of the 1950s, where hearty meals came with a side of familiarity. The kind of spot where the waitress didn't just know your name but also how you liked your coffee. For Malcolm Andrews, it was supposed to be his sanctuary, his first stop after months of chaos overseas. A quiet corner to sit, eat, and feel something close to normal again. The parking lot buzzed with life, pickup trucks lined up neatly beside sedans, their chrome bumpers gleaming under the soft afternoon light. Malcolm stepped out of his truck, boots crunching against the gravel beneath him. His uniform was impeccable, every thread in place, medals pinned proudly to his chest, catching the sunlight like tiny reflections of sacrifice. But this wasn't about accolades for Malcolm. No, the uniform meant something deeper: service, duty, principles that weighed heavy on his shoulders yet anchored him all the same. As he approached the diner, the door jingled softly, announcing his arrival. Inside, the hum of conversation filled the air, laughter, clinking silverware, the sizzle of burgers on the griddle, all blending into a comforting symphony. The scent of frying bacon and freshly brewed coffee wrapped around him like an old blanket, whispering, "This is home." Malcolm stepped inside, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to pause. Conversations softened, forks hovered midair, and curious eyes glanced in his direction, not with hostility, but with a subtle mix of surprise and uncertainty. Soldiers in full uniform weren't a common sight here, and his presence demanded acknowledgement. He met their stares with a polite nod before scanning the room. Booths lined the walls, occupied by families sharing fries, older couples leaning close in quiet conversation, and teenagers glued to their phones. A jukebox in the corner played a faint country tune, its melody weaving seamlessly into the background. Near the window, a small table sat empty, bathed in the golden glow of the afternoon sun. Malcolm made his way there, the sound of his boots clicking against the tiled floor drawing more glances. He moved with confidence born of years of discipline, yet his expression remained calm, almost reserved. Sitting down, he eased into the chair, his hands brushing over the worn edges of the menu. It was simple fare: burgers, milkshakes, fries, but exactly what he needed after months of eating field rations. A waitress approached, notepad in hand. She was in her 40s, her tired but friendly smile hinting at a hard-working life. Her hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, and though her uniform was slightly faded, it was spotless. "What can I get you, Han?" she asked, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd spent years putting people at ease. Malcolm smiled faintly. "Just a burger and coffee, black." "Thanks." She jotted down his order quickly, her pen dancing across the pad. "Coming right up. Let me know if you need anything else." As she walked away, Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window. Outside, the street was quiet, with only the occasional car rolling by. For the first time in days, he felt a brief moment of peace, a small reprieve from the noise in his head, the memories of far-off places that never quite left him alone. He allowed himself to breathe, to feel the stillness, the normalcy. But not everyone shared his moment of calm. Near the counter, the diner's manager stood leaning against the wall, arms crossed tightly over his broad chest. His graying hair and deep-set frown gave him an air of authority, but his eyes betrayed something else: suspicion. They scanned Malcolm in a way that felt invasive, almost challenging. Malcolm noticed the gaze but chose not to react. Years of training had taught him when to pick his battles, and this wasn't one of them. Instead, he focused on the window, watching sunlight bounce off the chrome bumpers of parked cars. Yet, he couldn't ignore the subtle tension rippling through the room. Conversations dipped slightly as he walked in, forks clattered louder against plates. It wasn't overt, but it was there, a ripple he couldn't unsee. The waitress returned with his coffee, setting it down gently in front of him. "Your burger will be out in a minute," she said, her tone kind but hurried. Malcolm thanked her, lifting the steaming cup to his lips. The bitterness of the coffee grounded him, a small comfort in an unfamiliar setting. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax, letting the world outside fade away. It was just him and his coffee, the warmth of the mug seeping into his hands. But as he took another sip, the manager's voice cut through the air, low, deliberate, and unmistakably directed at him. The man began walking toward Malcolm's table, each step slow and measured. Malcolm set his cup down, his shoulders tensing slightly. Whatever peace he'd felt moments ago was about to shatter. The sound of the manager's boots grew louder, each step carrying a weight that Malcolm couldn't ignore. When the man finally stopped in front of him, the room seemed to hold its breath. The manager stood a few feet away, posture stiff, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His presence drew subtle attention from the other patrons, who glanced up from their meals with growing curiosity. Malcolm looked up from his coffee, his calm expression meeting the manager's stony glare. The air felt heavier now, the warmth of the diner giving way to a tension that crept into every corner of the room. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the manager said, his voice low but firm. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "Excuse me?" he asked, his tone polite but edged with curiosity. "You heard me," the manager repeated, sharper this time. "We reserve the right to refuse service. You need to go." For a moment, Malcolm just stared at him, the calm mask he perfected in the military slipping into place. It wasn't the first time he'd faced hostility, but something about being back home made this sting in a way he hadn't expected. He glanced around the diner, noticing how the room had gone unnaturally quiet. Forks hung suspended over plates, and even the jukebox seemed to have dulled to a faint hum. "I'm just here for a meal," Malcolm said, his voice even. "This isn't about the food," the manager shot back, his tone dripping with implication. Malcolm's grip tightened around the edge of the table. He didn't respond right away, letting the manager's words hang in the air, giving everyone in the room a chance to feel the weight of what was happening. Slowly, deliberately, Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Let me make sure I understand," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge. "I walked in, ordered a burger and coffee, and now you're telling me I need to leave. Why?" The manager shifted uncomfortably but held his ground. "Like I said, we reserve the right to refuse service, and I'm exercising that right." Malcolm's eyes scanned the room again. A few patrons looked away, pretending to focus on their plates, while others stared openly, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Near the counter, the waitress who had taken Malcolm's order stood frozen, her pen hovering above her notepad. She opened her mouth as if to say something but hesitated, glancing nervously between Malcolm and the manager. Malcolm stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. He was taller than the manager by a good few inches, and the way he carried himself, shoulders back, head high, made the difference seem even greater. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't have to. "I served this country," he said, his words deliberate. "I wore this uniform for you, for everyone in this room. I've spent years defending the freedoms you take for granted every day. And now you're telling me I don't belong here?" The room was completely silent now, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The manager's face flushed red, though it was unclear whether it was from anger or embarrassment. "Look," he said, his voice faltering slightly, "I don't care where you served. This is my restaurant, and I make the rules." Malcolm took a step closer, his gaze never wavering. "You're right," he said quietly. "It is your restaurant. But let me ask you this, what kind of man turns away someone who's given everything to protect the very freedoms he enjoys?" The manager didn't answer, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. The patrons watched in silence, their discomfort growing with each passing second. The young couple in the booth nearest to Malcolm exchanged uneasy glances, while an older man at the counter shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. Malcolm could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him, but he didn't let it rattle him. Years of training had taught him how to stand his ground, even in the face of hostility. But this wasn't a battlefield, and the enemy wasn't someone carrying a weapon. It was ignorance, prejudice, and the quiet complicity of those who chose to look the other way. He reached into the pocket of his uniform, moving slowly and deliberately. A murmur rippled through the diner as a few patrons tensed, their imaginations jumping to the worst conclusions. Malcolm noticed but didn't react. He wasn't here to escalate the situation, he was here to make a point. From his pocket, he pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper, worn around the edges, the creases soft from being handled too many times. Holding it up for a moment, he said, "I wasn't planning to share this today, but maybe it's time I did." The manager frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. Malcolm unfolded the paper with care, the silence in the room so complete that the faint rustle of the paper seemed deafening. "This," Malcolm began, his voice steady, "is a letter from the family of Corporal Matthew Rivera. He served with me overseas. He didn't make it back." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The tension in the room shifted, the hostility giving way to something quieter, curiosity, maybe even guilt. Malcolm looked at the letter in his hands, then back at the room. "Before I read this, I want you to understand something," he said. "This uniform, I'm wearing it not just for me. It's for him, for his family, for every person who's ever had to say goodbye to someone they loved, not knowing if they'd come back." And as he began to read the words from the letter, they carried a weight that no one in the diner could ignore, leaving them hanging on his every word. The diner fell silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, heavy and unyielding. Malcolm's words hung in the air like smoke, curling around every corner of the room, leaving no one untouched. The weight of his story settled over them all, a shared burden they hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. People exchanged uneasy glances, their faces painted with a mixture of shame and introspection. No one spoke at first, the enormity of what they'd just heard pressed down on the room like an invisible force. Then, breaking the stillness, the older man sitting at the counter stood up. His chair scraped against the floor, the sound sharp and jarring in the quiet. He reached for his wallet, his movements slow but deliberate, as though he were performing a ritual. Clearing his throat, his voice steady but filled with conviction, he addressed Malcolm. "Sir," he said, his tone respectful yet firm, "I'd like to pay for your meal. It's the least I can do for someone who's given so much for this country." The manager, still frozen near the counter, opened his mouth as if to protest. But the older man silenced him with a sharp glance, his gaze cutting through the room like a blade. "If there's an issue with that," he said firmly, "you'll have to take it up with me." Malcolm looked at the man, his expression softening slightly. "That's kind of you," he said, his voice calm but measured. "It's not charity," the man replied, his tone unwavering. "It's respect." Before Malcolm could respond, a young woman sitting in a booth near the window spoke up. She had a toddler in her lap, squirming as she tried to keep him still. Her voice trembled slightly, but her words carried determination. "I'll pitch in too," she said. "You deserve to eat here just like anyone else." One by one, more voices joined in, each one adding to the growing chorus of solidarity. "You've got my respect," said a truck driver in the corner, nodding toward Malcolm. "I'll cover his coffee," the waitress said, stepping forward from her spot near the kitchen. She looked directly at Malcolm, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "My brother served too. He didn't make it home. Thank you for everything you've done." Even the teenage boy near the jukebox, who had been fidgeting awkwardly moments before, stood and gave Malcolm a small salute. It was clumsy, and his face flushed red with embarrassment, but the gesture was sincere. The manager, who had been shrinking further into the background with every passing moment, now looked entirely out of place in his own establishment. His face was pale, his arms hanging uselessly at his sides. He glanced around the room, realizing that he was alone in his stance. "I didn't mean to cause a scene," the manager muttered, his voice barely audible. Malcolm turned to face him fully, his calm demeanor unshaken. "You didn't just cause a scene," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You showed everyone here exactly who you are. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" The manager's face flushed deep red, and he looked down at the floor, unable to meet Malcolm's gaze. For a moment, he seemed to wrestle with his thoughts, his pride warring with the guilt that was now unmistakably etched across his features. I made a mistake," he stammered, his voice cracking slightly. He glanced around the room as if searching for some kind of support, but none came. The other patrons were silent, their faces a mix of disapproval and expectation. "Apologies don't mean much unless they come with change," Malcolm said. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled heavily in the air. The manager nodded slowly, his expression still uneasy. "You're right," he admitted. I'm sorry. It wasn't much, but it was a start." The tension in the room began to ease, the hostility giving way to something softer, an unspoken understanding that things could and should be different. The waitress stepped forward again, placing a steaming cup of coffee in front of Malcolm. Her hands were trembling slightly, but her smile was genuine. "Your coffee's on me," she said softly. Malcolm looked up at her, his expression warm. "Thank you," he said. He turned to address the room once more, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had lived through more than most could imagine. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about how we treat each other, every single one of us. If we can't show respect and kindness to the people sitting next to us, then what are we even fighting for?" The young mother near the window wiped a tear from her cheek, her toddler now dozing peacefully in her arms. The older man at the counter nodded solemnly, his weathered face thoughtful. Even the truck driver in the corner, who had been silently observing the whole time, seemed moved by Malcolm's words. As the room settled into a contemplative silence, all eyes remained on Malcolm, waiting to see what he would do next. But his next act wasn't what anyone expected, it was something that would stay with them long after he walked out the door. Malcolm stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the room settle. The silence wasn't heavy with tension anymore, it felt different now, like a collective pause as everyone reflected on what had just happened. He reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out his wallet. Without hesitation, he took out a crisp $20 bill and placed it on the table. "I'm paying for my meal," he said firmly, his voice carrying across the room. "Not because I have to, but because I want to. Respect isn't something that's handed to you, it's something you give, no matter what. And this is how I choose to give it." The statement caught everyone off guard, even the manager, who now looked like he wanted to disappear into the kitchen. Malcolm wasn't bitter, nor did he seem angry. There was a quiet strength in his actions, the kind that spoke louder than words ever could. He wasn't demanding pity, nor was he looking for applause. He was simply showing them the dignity he expected in return. Turning toward the older man at the counter, Malcolm extended his hand. "Thank you," he said, his tone filled with genuine gratitude. "Not just for what you said, but for standing up when it mattered." The older man shook his hand firmly, his expression resolute. "I should be thanking you," he replied. "For your service, for what you've done, and for reminding us all of what's important." Next, Malcolm turned to the young mother, who was still holding her toddler close. "Your kindness today means more than you know," he said softly. His words made her eyes well up with tears. She nodded, unable to speak, and gave him a small, grateful smile. As Malcolm stepped away from the table, the teenage boy who had saluted him earlier walked up timidly. His hands were stuffed into his pockets, but his face was determined. "Thank you for being brave," the boy said, his voice cracking slightly with nerves. Malcolm knelt slightly to meet the boy's gaze, his expression warm and encouraging. "It takes more bravery to stand up for what's right than to fight any battle," he said. "Remember that. One day, you'll need to stand up for someone else. And when that day comes, I hope you do." The boy's face lit up with pride, and he nodded enthusiastically. His parents, who had been watching from their booth, exchanged a glance that seemed to hold a silent acknowledgement. They would remember this moment for a long time. Finally, Malcolm's eyes landed on the manager. The man's face was still red, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of his guilt had physically diminished him. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Malcolm stepped closer, closing the distance between them. His voice was calm but carried an undeniable authority. "I'm not angry with you," Malcolm said. "But you need to ask yourself why you felt the need to treat me differently. Change doesn't happen unless we're willing to face the truth about ourselves." The manager nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I'll do better," he mumbled, the words barely audible. Malcolm stepped back and gave him a single, small nod. It wasn't forgiveness, it was an acknowledgement that the first step toward change had been taken. As he moved toward the door, the waitress stopped him one last time. She hesitated, her notepad clutched tightly in her hands. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "before you go, I just want you to know, my brother served too. He didn't make it home. When you talked about Matthew, it reminded me of him. Thank you for everything." Malcolm's expression softened. "Your brother's sacrifice isn't forgotten," he said gently. "None of them are. And it's people like you who keep their memory alive." The waitress nodded, blinking away tears. As Malcolm stepped outside, the bell above the door jingled faintly, and the golden light of the setting sun cast long shadows across the diner's parking lot. He paused by his truck, looking back at the building through the window. He could see the young boy, animatedly talking to his parents, the waitress wiping down the counter with a newfound sense of purpose, and the older man staring thoughtfully into his coffee. Even the manager had disappeared into the back, perhaps taking time to reflect on his actions. Malcolm climbed into his truck, the engine rumbling to life as he pulled onto the road. He thought about Matthew and the countless others who had never made it home. Their sacrifices weren't just for him, they were for everyone, even those who didn't always see the value in it. Inside the diner, the mood had shifted completely. Patrons spoke in hushed tones, sharing quiet reflections about what they had just witnessed. For the people in that room, this moment wasn't just a fleeting confrontation, it was a mirror, forcing them to see the biases they carried and the courage it took to challenge them. As Malcolm drove into the fading light, his actions left a mark that would ripple far beyond that small diner. It wasn't just about a meal, it was about respect, dignity, and the power of one man's courage to change hearts and minds.